Right. Well, welcome to this hugely popular segment, which most likely we may redo. This is a copy of the Honesty. This is the first ever Anarchist magazine produced in Australia from April 1887 to November 1888. And the Anarchist Institute book is out in 2011 because it's not available. So, what's interesting about this? Who are the anarchists in the 1880s and 1890s? What's their role, and if they have any significance in today, in 2023? The first anarchist organisation in Australia was set up on the 1st of May 1886. A public meeting was called by the brothers David and William Andrade to celebrate the 1st of May as a day of international protest as a result of a call by the Federation of United States and Canadian trade unions. Now, we think, and again we're not sure, we think the foundation members of the Melbourne Anarchist Club on the 1st of May 1886 at their first meeting were David Andrade, his brother William Andrade, Monty Miller, the great survivor from the Eureka Rebellion of 1854, Jack Andrews, and Chummy Fleming. And they set up that organisation. And it was based on the concepts of liberty, equality and fraternity. They were interesting characters. Remember, Melbourne in the 1880s was described as marvellous Melbourne. It was a boom city because of the gold which had come through the gold rushes. But by the end of the 1880s, Melbourne was, in many regards, a wasteland because of increasing unemployment and the fact there was no social security movement. And what the anarchists were saying then was significant. They used to have old public meetings down at the Queen's Wharfs, and they were involved in many activities. Who was David Andrade? David Andrade was actually born in Collingwood, son of Collingwood. He was a newsagent. He was a businessman, basically. He was a mutualist, and he had a lot of energy behind him. He was an author. Many of the articles in Honesty here are things he wrote. But the fascinating thing about reading Honesty, and you can read it online through the State's library, the fascinating thing is that many of the articles here, 135 years later, sound familiar. I mean, these were the only radical group in Australia at that particular point in time that was not anti-Chinese. The whole trade union movement was based on the concept of being anti-Chinese. They promoted female emancipation. They promoted mutual aid. They promoted collectivism. They promoted direct action. And they put their money where their mouth was. At one stage, Honesty was produced every month, and they were selling, and the key word is selling, over 6,000 copies of Honesty in Melbourne, which had a population of 250,000. They got to the stage where they had their own printing press, they were printing their own magazine, they had a whole heap of authors, they had good connections with the International Anarchist movement, which was growing in Europe. And they set up a housing collective at 47 Victoria Parade in Albert Park, which was basically a hotel for radicals who came into the city. They had their printing press there, and that ran simultaneously with the club. Now the club broke up in late 1888 as the Melbourne Anarchist Club on the very question that people talk about today, the question of the role of violence in a revolutionary movement. And David Andrade, and William Andrade, the founding members, found themselves on the outer, because they were basically individualists and mutualists who didn't believe in the use of violence, and people like Jack Andrews and Chummy Fleming. Well, Chummy was in the middle, but people like Jack Andrews and Monty Miller were on the other side. So the actual club as a functioning organisation collapsed in late 1888. But David Andrade continued being an organiser, propagandist, him and his brother, mainly him, and he set up a Liberty Hall at 213 Exhibition Street in the city. And if you go there now, it's the home to, I think it's a Chinese restaurant, but it's 3 stories. In the top story, they had meeting rooms and press. The second story was books for sale and magazines from around the world. And down the bottom they had a vegetarian restaurant, because David Andrade not only supported female emancipation, he was anti-racist, he was also a vegetarian because he believed animals had rights. So interesting, people that have these ideas and putting their money where their mouth is. Unfortunately, he created Liberty Hall in 1892, and within 18 months the whole thing had collapsed, because he wasn't a very good businessman. He set up Liberty Hall in the midst of one of the worst depressions in Victoria since the 1840s. So he was declared bankrupt, but this didn't stop him. What he did next is he went into publishing. He wrote a book called The Melbourne Riots. You can access this from the library, The Melbourne Riots and How Harry Holdfast and his friends emancipated the workers. More of a utopian type of novel. It's quite interesting. He then took up, at that particular point in time, there were so many unemployed in Melbourne that the government was actually concerned, the planning authorities were concerned about the threat of a real revolution. Things were so bad that a group of women with children went up to the old Melbourne jail, over 350 of them, demanding to be let into the jail so they'd have food to eat. You've got to remember, increased unemployment, no social security system, basically meant starvation for people. Right? So there were protests in the churches, there were protests on the streets. So the government, to try to water down these protests, what they did is they opened up pretty bad agricultural land to what we describe as homesteaders. Anybody who was willing to leave the city and live on one of these blocks of 5 to 10 acres, and the key is you have to live on it, in the places like French Island, the Dandenong Ranges, all out there, will get 10 acres of land, but they had to camp on it. Now, David Andrade took up that land and he became the postmaster for Callista. But, as luck would have it, by 1898, there were disastrous fires and he was totally burnt out. So not only was the home that he created burnt out, but by that time he had 5 children. I think one of his children died in the fires. And another one, a few months later, was bitten by a snake and also died. So by 1898, he basically had come to the end of his tether, and he was admitted to the Yarra Bend Lunatic Asylum. And he stayed there for the next 25 to 30 years until he died in 1828, when he was in the Ballarat Lunatic Asylum at that stage. So obviously, maybe he had maybe he was bipolar, when you think about it. Great bursts of energy, and then great, depression. It sounded like he was bipolar, but the fact is that he had a hugely detrimental effect on his children, and many of them descendants still live in Melbourne. I mean, they had names like Prodom, Kapotkin as their first names, and I've looked at some of the birth certificates. So this is the first, one of the most influential anarchists in Melbourne history, ends up in a lunatic asylum for the last 28 years of his life, and he's buried in somewhere in the St Kilda Cemetery. Now, being an editor of an anarchist magazine in the 1880s was not a good thing. Another well-known radical was W. Spence. W. Winspear. And he, in 1898, he produced a magazine in Hamilton in New South Wales called the Radical Australian, which he produced for about 12 months. But what happened to him was that he was involved in some type of monetary financial deception to keep the magazine going. He was arrested, he was in prison. His wife committed suicide 2 weeks after he was in prison, and his 5 children were left totally destitute. So that's the second Winspear. Now the other one, interesting character, would be Jack Andrade. A brilliant intellect, spoke 7 languages, born in Sandhurst, which is Bendigo, in the 1860s, went to Scots College, but never pursued a university education, was employed by the State Mining Department for a few years until he was dismissed for insubordination. That was the reason he was dismissed. Brilliant mind, but a very unusual character. There are 4 volumes of his poems which still exist. The magazines he wrote still exist. He died in 1903 at 37 from tuberculosis. He was well respected in labour circles. And once the split had occurred in the Melbourne Anarchist Club in 1888, he went to New South Wales, but he walked to New South Wales, and he became the editor of the Yay newspaper. And those of you who may remember the 1879 maritime strike, when Colonel Price told the soldiers on duty to lay them low and offered with guns, that's the protesters. He was the first one that reported that. So he wrote a number of books. He lived in abject poverty at one period when he was tramping from Melbourne to New South Wales, took him about 9 months. 90 days out of those 9 months he had no food, and he used to carry a rat catcher with him, and that was his main source of sustenance. He was poorly dressed, his hair was long, and he was also an opium addict, which was not uncommon in those days. It was called the Asiatic disease. Now, to show you how driven he was, this is a copy of a leaflet which you can have. It's a copy of a leaflet which is a woodblock print. So when he was living in caves on his way to Sydney, what he would do is he would carve out these letters in wood, then put ink on them and then paper on them to produce these leaflets which were handed out through New South Wales as he's travelled. He did some work on a number of newspapers. He eventually reached Sydney in 1890, I think it was 1892, 93, and he put out a magazine called Anarchist. Because he didn't have a printer's symbol on it, he was jailed for 3 months in the New South Wales prison. Then he put out another magazine called, first of all, Anarchy, Revolt. The magazine that was called Revolt, he was charged with seditious libel. Very unusual charge. Not many people have been charged with seditious libel. I think 4 in the history of Australia. And another one was Harry Seacombe, who was charged in 1854 because he was the editor of the Ballarat Times during the Eureka Rebellion. And he received 5 months jail for that. And by the time he came out, he became an orator on the Domain, but got sick of Sydney, returned back to Melbourne, where he was made editor of that very well-known Labor newspaper called Toscano, Toscano, T-O-C-I-S-I-N. He was well regarded by the Labor movement, right intellectual, but he contracted, because of his lifestyle, tuberculosis, died at the age of 37 in the Royal Melbourne Hospital, and is buried somewhere in an unmarked grave in Bundoora. So the 3 early anarchist editors all came to a sticky end. Andrade, the lunatic asylum. Jack Andrews found himself dying of tuberculosis, and Winspear lost his family and wife. So I think there's a message there for people involved in radical politics. Now, the only one who seemed to have prospered was Chummy Fleming. Now, Chummy Fleming was actually John Fleming. He was born in England. His mother died at the age of 5, and he was working as a bootmaker's assistant from the age of 10. In 1884, his uncle, I think he was 18 then, brought him out to Australia, where he took up his profession as bootmaker. He took up bootmaking, but he got very interested in the Australian secular movement, and in 1886 he was a foundation member of the Melbourne Anarchist Club. He sided with, well, he didn't side with David Andrade or Jack Andrews during the split. He was kind of in the middle. He was a practical human being. He was more interested in outcomes than theory. There's very little that's left that he actually wrote, but there's a lot of correspondence he had with some of the foremost anarchist figures of the period, like the Hopkins, Natalo, Emma Goldman, who he'd organised to come out to Australia and actually raise the money to pay her fare. At the last minute, because of personal issues, she wasn't able to come out. But he was involved in the unemployment struggle. He was involved in struggles to keep the emerging trade union movement honest. He was involved in anti-poverty struggles. He was full-time activist. He didn't die until 1950 at the age of 83. He was the instigator of the first May Day in Victoria, 1892, and for the rest of his life, even when the Leninists took over the May Day celebrations, he used to lead the May Day march. But in the 20s and 30s, because he had been kind of expelled from Trades Hall, he'd start off about half an hour early and they'd catch up to him. He was a very popular figure at the Yarra Bank, and for 50 years, every Sunday he had a stand at the Yarra Bank. He's the only person I know who's been jailed because he he led an open the state library on Sunday movement, and he was fined. He refused to pay the fine. He was jailed, and when he was jailed, he read the prison regulations at the old Melbourne jail, realised that the prison wasn't up to scratch, and when the superintendent came past, he buttonholed him for an hour and just told him the shortcomings of the prison, and believe it or not, things improved quite rapidly. But he got his wish. The state library was open on Sunday, but it only stayed open for about 6 months because the great unwashed workers really were not interested in going to the library on Sunday. They preferred to be drinking or doing something else, and the state library closed its doors to working people on a Sunday. He was an unusual man, and Australia's first Governor-General was Lord Hopkins. He was a bit of a ladies' man. He liked to live a good lifestyle, and he said to himself that Lord Hopkins that he wasn't being paid enough by the Australian government as Australia's first Governor-General. So in 1902, when he's crossing the Princess Bridge in his carriage and his fine horses and his police protection, Chummy Fleming jumps on the sideboard of the carriage and engages the governor in conversation about the plight of the poor in Melbourne. Because at this particular point in time, poverty was rampant. 10% of Melbourne women were involved in prostitution. Baby infanticide was rife. The baby farms were booming. Baby farms where you left your baby for a price, and if you didn't pay the price, the baby disappeared, basically. It wasn't a very particular pleasant place, Melbourne, at that particular time. And he regaled Lord Hopkins, and Lord Hopkins listened, and maybe he just was pissed off with the first Australian government. And he developed a friendship with Chummy Fleming, the Governor-General and the Anarchist. He lent Chummy Fleming money. You're going. Yeah, that's right. Thank you very much for coming. All right, we'll just thank you, Michael, and thank you for making the effort. All right, all the best.
Sorry, we were late.
No, don't be sorry. All the best. You want me to get up here? No, you're right. All right. So yeah, thank you for coming. So we had this relationship
Do you want
between.
us to change the seats?
No, it's all right.
Is that working?
Yeah.
You don't care.
No, but if you want to sit, Gaz, you want to sit there, that's fine. Yeah. So Lord Hopkins and Chummy Fleming became an item, and Lord Hopkins actually lent Fleming money to build a home at 2 Argyle Place in Carlton. If you go there today, there's a 7-Eleven on the corner, but if you look behind the 7-Eleven, there is a lane called Chummy Place. It is the only place in Australia that's been named after an anarchist. Because he lived at 2 Argyle Place in Carlton until 1950, at the age of 83, when he was found dead in his place. Now the bloke who wrote Jack Hardy, was it Jack Hardy or John Hardy? Writer. What was his name? Hardy. In the 50s, he wrote Hardy. No, well, he wrote a little piece about him, and he called it the three-legged anarchist, because poor old things were so bad when he died that he was sleeping on a three-legged bed. That's how bad things were. And there are a number of articles around the Australia bemoaning his demise. He was a very popular Yarra Bank orator, and he used to use a cowbell to call people to listen, and he had 2 banners, red banners, on which he had the words freedom and I think liberty on the banners, which were used to drape behind him on a tree. And the State Library actually acquired those banners, and occasionally when they have displays about radical Melbourne in the 1880s, 1890s, they bring out those banners. But his last wish was, because he'd been involved from the very first May Day celebration, and he'd been involved in May Day celebration for almost 60 years, is that his ashes be scattered on the Yarra Bank. Now, I think he died in April, could be wrong, 1950. Now, on the day, the organising committee realised that Chummy's ashes had been misplaced somewhere in Trades Hall. So they contacted the Butchers Union, who brought across a tin of ashes, most likely animal ashes, which there was about 5,000 people at to see Chummy off, down the Yarra Bank, and they threw the ashes against the wind. So all the dignitaries on the stage got a mouthful and an eyeful of Chummy Fleming. So he had to understand. So again, unusual. A lifetime of activism, minimal results. Minimal results. And unfortunately this has been the lesson of Melbourne anarchism and Victorian anarchism. Strange people doing things to promote ideas which have had minimal traction in society. The thing about the Melbourne Anarchist Club and Honesty, their magazine, is that if you look at the articles, some have been penned by women, some have been penned by men. You look at the articles that were produced during this 1.5 year period, you will see extraordinary things. Like here is this is Honesty, what number 4, price 8 pence, 28th of August 1887, and there's it's 4 pages on Chinese labour. The fact that the problem isn't Chinese labour, the problem is the fact that Chinese labour is exploited, and so the problem isn't the Chinese, the problem is the employing class, and it goes on and on. So these weren't just people who were Labour supporters. They saw beyond that. These were people who promoted many of the ideas that single issue movements promote today. Ideas like female emancipation, the racist movement, animal have rights, free love, and the list goes on and on. So they were extraordinary people with extraordinary ideas. And the great thing is, and that's what we did with the Anarchist Age Weekly Review, which we produced 1,000 volumes over a 22-year period, is we put a deposit of the material in the State Library as well as the National Library. There's no National Library then. And if these publications had not been placed in the State Library, they would not be available to us today. So I say to these men and women, you did what you could when you could. And there's a lot of funny stories. Like another anarchist activist, he used to do his own printing. This is in Melbourne, but he didn't have a press, so they printed, and then his wife, who had a large derriere, would actually sit on the press for it to be printed. So these people went to extraordinary lengths. And remember, this is a period when you've got to work. There's no social security. I mean, Chummy Fleming worked on and off as a bootmaker. That was his job. Now, I'll go back a step to Chummy Fleming and Lord Hopkins. It's a fascinating story. Now, Lord Hopkins actually resigned. He's one of the few Governor Generals that has resigned. I think the next one was Hollingworth, the Archbishop. But he resigned because he didn't think he was being paid enough by the Australian government. So as a parting gesture, he donated money and champagne, 25 bottles of French champagne from his personal cellar as well as money, Chummy Fleming, to distribute to the poor. I think it was the 24th of June 1892. Now, the first day they distributed sixpence to every single man and a shilling to every married man. And the next day it was a free-for-all. There was 25 bottles of French champagne, and there were 6 barrels of beer that had been donated by a local brewery. And by the end of the day, there was rioting in the streets of Carlton. And there's an Age report where they asked Chummy Fleming what he thought about all this. Why didn't he sell the alcohol? He said, well, you know, working people have the right to enjoy the same standard liquor as the rich. Champagne is good enough for the rich, it's good enough for the poor. So he had a sense of humour. Another period which is interesting is when the first Parliament was held in Melbourne, it was in the Melbourne Exhibition Hall, right? And he invited himself to the celebration for the opening of the first Parliament. And he wandered round the crowd, drinking champagne, eating the best food for 3 hours, followed by 3 detectives who weren't willing to arrest him because he would make a fuss. They didn't want a fuss. So he had courage. He had that courage. But again, it's interesting, he never formed any strong relationships. We don't think he ever had a relationship with a woman. Maybe he was young. In those days, you know, it's not the type of thing we spoke about. I don't know. Maybe anarchism attracts unusual people. And maybe what anarchism is about is actually about not creating a society which is based on commonwealth and the creation of society based on direct democratic principles. Maybe the anarchist's role, in Western society at least, is to promote ideas which other people are not willing to promote. Because the word anarchist is very simple, it means without rulers, and the anarchist struggle is the struggle to create a society without rulers, not without rules. As Chummy Fleming said, when he was expelled from the Melbourne Trades Hall because of his activities, he said, I'm an anarchist. Anarchists have been electrocuted, guillotined, strangled and hung around the world. But we will continue to exist. And today, if you look at the Australian anarchist movement, it's almost insignificant. Almost insignificant. It has made no great strides. There is little interest in the principles, little interest in the history, little interest in moving forward. But the fact is, and I keep saying this, is that as the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse get stronger and stronger, and the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse are climate emergency due to unrestrained development, increasing population growth, an economic system dominated by corporate capitalism, which is based on creating profits irrespective of human, social and environmental costs. And last but not least, let's get this right, Joe, last but not least, finite resources. There is not planet B out there that we can all go to. Maybe a few very wealthy people will go to, but most of us can't. So has problems increase in society? It may be that people will stop looking towards rulers to solve their problems, that they'll stop, they'll tear up their membership, that somebody should do something about that tribe. They'll stop fighting amongst each other because of their different religions, their sexuality, where they live, what language they speak, their race, and maybe they will be forced, and that's the key, be forced to unite in order to survive. And that's what anarchism is about. It's about keeping those ideas based on the creation of a new society which is based on equal decision making and equal power, direct democratic principles, common storehouse economics as part and parcel of the thinking of not just a small group minuscule group, but thinking of everyday people. Now, there have been large anarchist movements, like during the Spanish Revolution, during the Paris Commune, and many other, during the Magno period in Ukraine. Obviously, they've all been drowned in a sea of blood, because what they want, basically, is directly opposed to the type of societies we have, where rulers have the ability to determine the lives of billions of people. So all I can say is I take off my hat to the initial founders of the Melbourne Anarchist Club. Monty Miller, who I haven't really mentioned, I'll say a few words. Monty Miller was a 15-year-old boy, camped outside the Eureka Stockade in 1854. One of the Redcoats and the Victoria Police had gone through the encampment, bayoneting people. He was one of the first that jumped over the stockade to assist the wounded stockaders. He was involved in many, many radical and working struggles, right up to the anti-conscription movement in World War I, when at the age of 83 he was jailed for 6 months for being a member of the anti-conscription movement, which revolved around the IWW, International Workers'
87.
87, was it? My apologies.
No, did you say at the age of 87?
Yeah.
He was jailed.
For 6 months.
6 months.
Yeah. Yeah.
I hope they looked after him.
Well, he survived. He got out of that.
He wouldn't be able to be.
Wouldn't be able to
breaking stones.
Not in those days. Yeah, because he was a member of the Industrial Workers of the World. But that's the 20th century. So all I can say is I take my hat off to these people. I'd also like to mention William Andrade, which was David's brother. He wasn't as active as David, but he was interesting. Went across to Sydney to create a Sydney Anarchist Club. Never was able to do that. He set up shops in Melbourne, down at 201 Burke Street. It was basically a shop for magicians, which went into the 1920s. And he was involved in the first, he translated Lenin's works and put them out in English in Australia. So, but again, I usually find the 11th of November very interesting in Australian history, because poor old Bill Andrade, at the age of 73, went surfing, body surfing down at Manly Beach in Sydney. He was dumped by a wave. Guess when? On the 11th of November, 1939, and he died that same day. Why the 11th of November? Well, the 11th of November is an interesting day in Australian history. The 11th of November, 1854, the Ballarat Reform League was formed. That's the organisation behind the Eureka Rebellion. On the 11th of November, 1880, over 6,000 people gathered outside Melbourne Jail, where Ned Kelly was hung. The 11th of November 1980, the Armistice, the end of the war to end all wars, which was fought by workers rather than the bayonet for the glory of God, King and country. The 11th of November, the most reformist government this country has had. In 1975, the Whitlam Labor government was removed from office by the Governor-General, we assume at the behest of outside influences like the United States and Britain. And then, if you look at the 11th of November 1939, poor old Will Andrade died. So all I'm saying to you is, if you're listening to this, don't do anything silly on the 11th of November, because if you're a radical, you'll come to a sticky end. That's it. Thank you for coming. Any questions?
Who was the one with Eureka Stockade?
Monty Miller.
Monty Miller.
Yeah, Monty Miller, the great Monty Miller. Trade union activist. They used to call him the grand old radical from 1854 to 1916 when he was jailed. Could have been 71.
So there's 1,000 volumes of this at the State Library?
No.
No?
I'll let you have,
Over
you can have a look at
2 years.
this is the Honesty. This is the publication from April 1887 to November 1888 called Honesty. This is the publication of the Melbourne Anarchist Club. What I spoke about is the magazine that the Anarchist Media Institute put out from about 1992 to about 2013, and we put out a 4-page weekly Anarchist magazine for 1,000 volumes. It's called the Anarchist Age Weekly Review. At one stage it was the only Anarchist English weekly in the world, and those copies are deposited in the Melbourne State Library as well as the National Library of Australia. They're online, so they're easy to access. So, unfortunately in the digital age, you find that you don't deposit things in the State Library anymore, and it'll all be lost. They're all going to be lost, unfortunately. Gaz was down at Murchison, he was a star.
You know, it was good though. It was,
Really
a nice
well.
day.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, can I?
Could you just turn that off for me? Yeah.
See ya.
Just pull it